Welcome to Voices in Local Government, an ICMA podcast. My name is Gabe Darty, and I'm joined by my ERC partner, Tamika Lee from the National League of Cities. And today we're discussing the Economic Recovery Corps program with Vonette Harris, a current Economic Recovery Corps fellow, and her host, Laura Searfrost, who is with Enterprise Community Partners in Maryland. Welcome, Vonette and Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, the Economic Recovery Corps program, or ERC for short, is funded by the Economic Development Administration, the EDA, and led by the International Economic Development Council, IEDC. This program is designed to help communities build long-term economic resilience by investing in people, nurturing relationships, and strengthening local systems. 65 dynamic fellows, from accomplished entrepreneurs to nonprofit professionals, from veterans to passionate community leaders, have spent the last 2 years in communities all over the country, large and small, working to deliver lasting impact. The website for the program is the economicrecoverycorps.org and is linked wherever you are listening.
Laura, Enterprise Community Partners is well respected in the housing space. Can you share a bit more about the organization's work and what made ERC feel like a right fit to move forward? And building on that, could you also talk about the project itself and what made it feel especially urgent right now?
As you said, Enterprise is a national affordable housing organization that addresses the need for affordable housing nationwide across multiple angles, policy and programs, where our ERC project fits, capital and development, especially across the Mid-Atlantic market where I sit. Through the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, we have been bringing a lot of our tools that we have at Enterprise together with other partners. And we've made a lot of progress toward a shared goal to add or preserve 17,000 homes for households living near the new light rail in Maryland. And through our coalition-based work, we've really increased our toolbox for housing preservation. We've worked for more funding through local and private preservation funds, technical support and training to developers, and right of first refusal policies. But at the same time, we had a challenge. We know that a lot of existing buildings can be lost in a lot of different ways, and we didn't have the tools to really align our toolbox with the properties that were most at risk of coming out of the supply. So our project is really intended to address kind of that need for stronger coordination and alignment of those tools and at-risk properties. And so our ERC work, I think, was really intended to help kind of bring those to the properties that needed them the most, to the communities that needed them the most. And so, what our project really does is brings together government partners, tenant serving groups on a regular basis to really look at data, share information about what properties are most at risk, and then start to strategize around what is possible. This is a really critical moment for Purple Line communities in our work within the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. We have a housing goal to produce or preserve 17,000 homes for households earning less than $72,000 a year before the Purple Line opens, which is right now the end of next year, 2027. And, we really wanted to figure out ways to accelerate our work in this critical moment. And this was this preservation network and our ERC project was really one way to do that.
Thank you. Vonette, what was your introduction and first thoughts on this program and the possibilities that you saw?
As a person that believes that access to quality, affordable housing is a fundamental right and not a privilege, I saw alignment with the core values of what the ERC program was attempting to accomplish. It wasn't your traditional technical assistance model, but embedding experienced practitioners into communities to help move complex work forward in real time. ERC was very people-centered, which really resonated with me. I've operated in the affordable housing, economic community development space for nearly 2.5 decades, and I've seen firsthand, what are those big barriers to housing production and preservation. And it's not always policy and funding. A lot of times it's capacity. So the idea that this program was intentional in its design to pair local efforts with on the ground expertise felt both timely and necessary. Having already worked in the Purple Line and seeing the risk of displacement, I really thought that the ERC fellowship opportunity could be a great game changer. Um, I think stakeholders in the PLCC, including my host organization, saw that there was a critical gap in our ecosystem and also reaching our housing goals, specifically to housing preservation. And so this fellowship kind of gave us the opportunity to create a real launching pad to really start talking about preservation work and being intentional of bringing stakeholders together to address critical issues.
Wow. Vonette, you've been in the fellowship and with the enterprise for about 30 months. We're coming up on the tail end of your time. Looking back, what would you say were some of your biggest accomplishments? I know the list is long, but just a few of them.
I've learned through this fellowship, you guys love to do these reflection points. So I think my biggest accomplishments can be kind of directed in, I would say, three buckets: coalition building, direct impact, and system change. The most significant accomplishment, of course, was assisting my host organization in operationalizing and standing up the Purple Line Preservation Network, bringing together stakeholders that Laura mentioned to collaborate and to discuss firsthand and think of problem solves about troubled properties along the corridor. Through this process, we were able to witness in real time and firsthand the power of effective collaboration. When you have open dialogue, shared accountability, and real commitment to problem solving across the sector, I think we've seen a shift in our work. It's less fragmented and it's more aligned along the corridor. The second thing that I would say would be the collaboration has really led to tangible outcomes through the direct technical assistance that I provide to housing operators, um, emerging developers, and tenant associations. Since this fellowship had launched, I have successfully helped stabilize 154 families that were at risk of displacement and have secured approximately 7.4 million and counting in public resources to preserve affordable housing along the corridor, providing customized technical assistance that could range from assisting an operator in accessing grant dollars to make energy improvements, assisting emerging developer in acquiring a property along the corridor, utilizing the county's right of first refusal, or working with a tenant association and helping them to negotiate a community benefits agreement, if you will, with a purchaser to address their main concern of housing affordability long term. And I think on the policy side, I think this has just recently happened, was contributing to the efforts of the passage of House Bill 85 with Governor Westmore, allowing for limited equity housing cooperatives, creating a new pathway for long-term affordability and community ownership. This work was rooted in the technical support that I provided to the Leland, a 15-unit building in the city of Tacoma Park, where I assisted the tenant association in raising capital to acquire their building and make meaningful improvements. So I think that's probably a long list of accomplishments.
Yes, yes, that's awesome. And Laura, from your perspective and your organization, tell us a little more about where your organization serves. I feel like it's just not just in the one place where you sit, Laura, but would love to know really just about the success in your eyes and your perspective and the community. Maybe what lessons that other communities elsewhere could learn from having a program like this or being involved in a program like this to have someone like Vonette in their community. I know your working relationship is close, so just would love to know a little bit more about that.
Well, first of all, I just want to give Vonette her flowers because I think so much of what she said are, in my mind, the keys to success, especially that broad thinking about how do you think about work within a coalition and creating the infrastructure for collaboration, which I really feel is, what our project has done around housing preservation. And then also, thinking about how that, both is at the, the biggest picture, the need for policy changes to fill gaps. And we have a better understanding now, I think, of some of those gaps going forward. And then also, right, the very granular, like individual project by project, working with the property owner or the developer or the tenant association. So I just want to say, like, I think, it's all kind of the keys to success in many ways, I think, are wrapped up in what Bonnet just articulated. I would add, I think, to me, reflecting on the preservation network, which is still kind of in its infancy in my mind, is, it sits within our broader Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which is housed at the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland. And I do think having our network kind of live within this broader network of partners who are focused on housing, but also focused on other goals like small business development, workforce development, and culture and vibrant places is just, I think, really important, because I think it, we already have a common interest when we're coming together. And I think that's one of the things that has made our work really effective very early on, was we have, this shared interest, this shared investment in these communities. So I think it's really helped, spur problem solving very quickly. I also want to say, some of the way the collaboration happens is not by accident. Vonette and I have been really intentional about how we designed and set up the network. So we spent, I think, a good portion of the first year of the ERC fellowship really working to understand how other networks across the country operate, some of which Enterprise is also involved in other markets that we're active in. Also talking to the folks we thought we'd want around the table at the onset to understand, like, what would bring them to the table, but also what would keep them at the table. And so by the time we, launched the network at the beginning of 2025, like, a lot of people's ideas were already, kind of embedded in, the way we wanted to operate. And so I think that was also really like a key to our success. And then lastly, we just have, I think, an amazing data partner in the National Center for Smart Growth. So prior, we were talking about different, gaps we had and challenges we had. Prior to us working on this project, we didn't, our universe for what we needed to preserve, whether it was through, loss of subsidy or deterioration or operational inefficiencies, or redevelopment, it was a whole universe of like 700 buildings in the Purple Line Corridor. And the National Center for Smart Growth, through their property inventory and risk assessment, were able to shrink that universe for us. And we were able to use that to really focus our conversations with our network partners, and also draw on their knowledge of what's happening on the ground. So we kind of have this reinforcing cycle of information and the ability to bridge quantitative and qualitative data. So, I just want to, acknowledge just the mutual benefit of their academic interest and our community need or, ability to apply it. And I also, think it's really something that I think other communities can learn from. Like, we have data, we have a great data partner, but there's lots of data in community, including, people who are working on the ground, people who are using programs. And so really thinking about how to mine that data for collaboration, for problem solving, I think has also been something that I credit, our early successes to as well.
Vonette, one of the unique strengths of ERC is the idea of having boots on the ground to help move important work forward. Alongside your work with the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, how have you seen this effort begin to make a difference for residents and property owners along the corridor? And what impact feels most tangible so far?
The boots on the ground component of the fellowship has really been critical because it allows us to move from ideas and put it into execution so that we start to see real tangible impact. Through my work with the corridor, the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, as well as the Preservation Network, one of the biggest differences I've seen is the ability to provide that real hands-on tailored technical assistance to, residents, to developers, to municipalities, to existing property owners. That means we're not just talking about preservation strategies, that we were actually helping them structure deals, raise capital, come up with preservation strategies, negotiate agreements and terms. And so that's what I've seen. So for residents, what's really tangible for residents is stabilizing their homes. As I stated, this fellowship, I've been able to secure 154 families at risk of displacement. You know, without the intervention, these families would have lost their homes. You know, which that has real impact. Affordability is a national crisis in this country, and so it's not easy for someone to pick up and move somewhere else because there's a plethora of affordable housing somewhere. From a property owner's perspective, what this network has really brought to bear is that particularly for our smaller mission aligned owners, the impact has shown up in helping them getting access to capital and information. Many are good actors and want to preserve housing, but lack the capacity or the resources or tools to be able to navigate where to apply, when to apply, how to access funds. And so being embedded has allowed me to bridge that gap and really help them see a viable path of making improvements to their property and extending affordability. And I think from a broader level, what's become more tangible is the shift in how in which we operate. I remember very early on in our discussions with Laura, I said she had made a statement. She's like, you know what, we could be designing this and people may not show up. And I was like, what? Oh, wait a minute. What do you mean they won't show up? Like, how would this work? So now seeing it actually operationalized, that we've created a space for open dialogue and faster problem solving and coordinated action, we're really starting to see an impact both as far as immediate on the ground with people as well as systems shifting. So I think our impact is going to be long lasting in both segments.
I don't know. I got kind of chills just kind of listening about all of that. Tamika, I would love to kind of point it towards you and the National League of Cities. I know you guys see many of the same issues with housing and transportation, and affordability and displacement play out in cities all across the United States, not just in the communities that Lynette and Laura are serving, but we see it all over. Would love for you to tell us what kind of you guys are seeing that's really exciting about the work that Lynette and Enterprise have been able to accomplish through the ERC program.
I am a huge fan of Enterprise Community Partners, and I think that the work aligns of what we're seeing nationally. I think it's really brave to, look to the community first. I think that some cities are really seeing that shift where the community's voice really matters and preserving that legacy within communities. That's really huge. We do work to really look at communities and say, hey, what's the lowest hanging fruit? Some communities we went from really wanting big box stores to go into communities, which then leads to potentially gentrification and moving folks out. So that anti-displacement work is huge, especially around the Purple Line. I think we haven't even scratched the surface. I think that what Laura and Vonette didn't mention is what may have brushed on, but the impact on residents and small businesses. I think that when cities are looking at legacy, they also are taking into account older adults. So that infrastructure has to be there. When we look at sort of the economy and who holds the wealth, it's a lot of times it's those residents that have lived there for years and years or generations. So preserving that. And we're also seeing sort of the intersection between economic development, housing, and then transportation. So I think that Enterprise Community Partners sits right at the center of what we're seeing nationally. And I think that what they're doing on the ground could really be a model for other cities. And both Laura and Vonette know every chance we get to put their story out there, we do. Because I really do think that their work is at the helm of change. So I will turn this back on you all. This is a question for both you, Laura and Vonette. There's increasing attention at the connection between housing and economic development and the role housing plays as a driver for long-term community growth. As you reflect on the lasting impact of the work in your experience over the past 2 years in the ERC, how has this program shaped the way you think about economic development?
It's such a good question. And I think, I also want to just say, like, thank you for the kind words. I want to give, attention to the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, because I think, Bonnet and I would not have, be here if it was not for the leadership of the coalition and some of its early founders, including the former director at the National Center for Smart Growth, and having that legacy continue under its current leadership. So I just want to, acknowledge that I totally agree, and it would not be possible without great partners like them. I think that's a great segue, because just in reflecting on, as a host, being part of the ERC, and predominantly working on the housing components of economic development, you know, I'm always struck by, the keys to success, whether you're talking about housing or economic development or transportation, they all kind of boil down to the same things, trust, strong partnerships, system level solutions. And so I think that's probably my biggest takeaway. And then I think the second one is, I think, we housers would love to be invited to more economic development conversations, and also for all the housers listening, really making those economic development connections, because sometimes we can be, in talking about the same issues, but in different rooms.
Wow. Just to kind of add to what Laura has said, I think from a national perspective, I think there's been a shift where I think more practitioners are recognizing that housing is infrastructure. It is just as critical to the health and stability of our communities as roads, water systems, and transit. You know, uh, we now see that when communities invest in mass transit or other major economic systems, it sends a very strong signal of permanence and growth. But often, though that signal leads to housing speculation, rising costs, displacement pressures for both renters as well as homeowners. I know our emphasis is on renters, but it also has a traumatic impact on long-term homeowners, which are usually the seniors that Tamika mentions. And so I think what's really powerful about the PLCC and the PLPN is that these coalitions are not just waiting to react to these outcomes. They emphasize the importance of putting proactive anti-displacement strategies in place during the planning stage of the transit system, as well as the construction phase of the planning of the transit system, and not just waiting to see the impact already take shape. Because when you're reactive, then it's too late. And so I think is that forward-thinking approach is exactly what's needed to really protect communities. And then to echo what Laura said, the whole emphasis of coalition building. No one organization can solve the problem related to housing affordability and anti-displacement, certainly not in their individual silos. What we've seen is that through this work, the intentionality of bringing together mission-aligned stakeholders at all sectors to collaborate, share information, share responsibility, and problem solve has impact. And that makes the collaboration so much more effective, because no one entity has to do everything. They can stay within their strengths and their organizational constraints while contributing to a shared vision that again results in real meaningful impact. So at the end of the day, it's all about building systems and partnerships that leads to meaningful tenant stability and long-term affordability for a more equitable, connected community.
I love that, Vonette and Laura. It's good work. It's hard work. But I'm so grateful that there are folks like you all that are on the ground doing that work in your community, and hopeful that others would be inspired to kind of get that work going. It feels like, the saying that they always say, we'll go further and longer together. So love that, the collaboration that has happened not only between the two of you, but within your coalition. Like, it's inspiring. It really is. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to talk with Tamika and I about your work. If any of our listeners are interested in learning more about the ERC program, you can visit economicrecoverycorps.org. But before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would encourage our listeners to find more information about a program that you're working on or any of your work? Anything else you would encourage them to look into?
So, of course, Enterprise Community Partners website is just a treasure trove of resources related to the issues we talked about today, but also much broader. And we have tools that span rural and tribal communities, as well as more of the context in which Vonnet and I talked about today. Also, our newsletter, we have kind of a series of newsletters that can keep you up to date both on things that are happening nationally, but also within our market. So when you sign up, please opt into the Mid-Atlantic newsletter, because I think that's also where we get to tell some of these stories, and we'll continue to tell our story of our project as it lives on past the ERC fellowship timeframe. I would also direct folks listening to the Purple Line Corridor Coalition's website, which is purplelinecorridor.org, as well as National League of Cities Housing Supply Accelerator resources, which can also speak to aspects of zoning reform and other ways to add homes while also preserving the ones that already serve people in your communities.
I would just echo all the things that Laura said, as far as great resources. And also, I would say direct individuals to the ICMA website, because it's a plethora of resources, as well as the IEDC. Both organizations have toolkits and recent literature that talks about timely issues that we're facing. Housing affordability is a crisis. I just this week actually participated in a 3-day course offered by the IDC in business retention and expansion. And the number one thing, or the one critical item that kept resonating in all the little breakout groups for different things, the topic that kept rising to the surface was housing affordability was one of the major impediments for job growth, expansion, retention, and evolution. And so I really hope that in this space that people will recognize that we have to be intentional about how we address this housing crisis, because it's affecting us all. I mean, I was in groups with rural communities, major markets, mid-level markets, and they're all dealing with the same thing. The narrative, might have been slightly different, but the core of the problem was the same. And so I just hope that people will recognize that housing is a critical economic driver to economic prosperity, and that there needs to be real focused attention about how you address it. And so if you have a major project in your city or municipalities, please do the forward thinking and be proactive and not reactive. And Enterprise has great toolkits on their website to teach you how to be proactive thinkers about how to solve critical problems.
Like Gabe, this gives me chills, and to know all of the great work you all are doing, especially in the Washington, D.C. area. The Purple Line has been, in progress for some years now. So to see and witness the work that's happening on the ground, not just about the transportation, but also about housing, that's really important. Love the work that you all are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, the website for the program is economicrecoverycorps.org, and it will be linked wherever it is you are listening.